Hi, in this module we're going to be talking about the church and the Crusades. So in the last module we talked a little bit about, we had an introduction to the Middle Ages and talked a little bit about the feudal system. And in this module we're going to be focusing on the church and the Crusades. So quick review from last time about the feudal system. So we are in a political context where the power is decentralized and power is based on title and land ownership. So we no longer have the unified territory that was under Charlemagne, but we have a division of territories headed by lords. So, as mentioned earlier, land ownership was important, and large landowners would build castles, fortresses, and this is kind of how the feudal system was born. And in the feudal system, we have vassals. So you would have a king or a prince who would be the head of the territory. And then within the castle, you might have some counselors. Some of them might be from the church, some of them might be nobility. You could even have knights counseling the Lord. But what you wouldn't find would be peasants counseling the head of the territory. So the peasants were really at the bottom of the barrel, kind of being taken advantage of, whereas the rest of the people within the feudal system did have some perks. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about politics and religion. So before the church kind of involved itself in the politics of the land, there were two main orders. There were the warriors and the peasants, so those who worked the land and those who fought for the land. Now we see a third order emerge, and it's those who pray. So we have warriors, peasants, and people who pray. So the standing of those who pray within the feudal system is comparable to the knights as far as class goes. They have access to the castle, but they don't necessarily live with the nobility in the castle. Now they had some other perks. The religious order did not have to pay taxes. Those who paid taxes really were only the peasants. The peasants were supposed to give 1/10 of what they produced to the church, and that was called a tithe. And this is still a tradition that's theoretically maintained today, where you're supposed to give, if you are, let's say, Catholic, you should be giving 10% of your earnings to the church. But peasants could not become priests, or they could not belong to the religious orders. Priesthood was not available to all. It was somewhat of something given to those who had a little bit more privilege, let's say. So let's not forget that the religious orders did have much control over the land. They were able to manage about 1/5 to 1/3 of the territory, and land is power. So having the ability to manage the land and decide who can work the land and who can collect from the land gives them quite a bit of power in that regards. So we're living in a period where the church and the Lord, or the king and the prince, the systems, the religious and the political systems, are heavily intertwined. let's not forget that the system was beneficial to both the church and to the nobility or the royalty, since the church gave credence to the king and the king provided resources for the church. So they had a mutually beneficial relationship. Now, not everyone wanted there to be so much involvement between the church and the state. Some wanted to have more independence from the state specifically. So at this point, we're going to see some reform movements emerge. So we are in the 10th century, more or less, and we are going to look at a couple reform movements that happen where the church wants to assert some independence from the state. And the first movement that we're going to look at is the Cluniac Reform Movement. As you can see, it's in 909 AD. And here you have what looks like an abbey. So this movement began in Cluny in Burgundy. And I'm just going to go over to the next slide to show you where that is. Okay, so here you have a few pictures. You have a picture of the Burgundy area. You may be familiar with the Burgundy area. It's known for its wine, especially its Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. You can see it's kind of in the northern area of France, and it's close to the Parisian region, relatively speaking. Paris is a little bit to the west of that region. Also, if you look at the closer map, there you can see towards the right there, you can see Dijon, which is famous for its mustard. Okay, so let's go back to the church reform movement. Okay. So what the Cluniac Reform Movement did is that they wanted a more pious lifestyle. They wanted to return to the roots a little bit more and adhere to the rules, and have a greater, more profound study of the liturgy. And this also meant that they were scholars. They encouraged scholarship, and they were also great artists. Made some beautiful illuminations and were spectacular builders. So if I go back one slide, or maybe two, yeah, one slide, the picture you have here is also a picture that you have on page 82 of your textbook, which is a Cluniac illumination. So that would have been found in a book, and you can just see the beautiful vibrant colors and the details in the monks' faces and the details in the clothes. And this is a representation of the consecration of the altar at Cluny. So it's quite detailed and absolutely beautiful colors. So you can see that great artists. And also I'm going to move forward a couple slides to show you some other things. Okay, so on the bottom there you have some sculptures that would have been probably by the church, in the walls of the church. And there you can also see just the wonderful detail and expressions and movement of these sculptures. And on top there you have the abbey, and it's quite a complex system, but you could imagine very livable. If you were a monk, it would be a very pleasant place to live, surrounded by such beautiful art and gardens and self-sufficiency. So I'll let you take a look at that for a minute. Just take a look at all the different parts of the abbey, and just, it's a little city of its own. Okay, now going back a little bit. Okay, so just wonderful scholars and artists. And they also wanted to return to, they didn't want to take advantage of the poor. They wanted to take care of the poor. So they didn't want to benefit from the hard work that these people were doing. And they did not like the involvement of the government or the state in the church. So they wanted to kind of separate themselves from political affairs. So this movement took off. It was a large movement. It moved outwards, and it ended up having about 1,500 houses by the late 11th century. And this movement, the Cluniac Reform movement, spawned other movements, which will cause further separation between church and state. So let's take a look at that. I'm just going to skip forward a few slides. So there you have Burgundy, which looks like a fantastic place to perhaps go for a bike ride or just enjoy the day. And there you have the Abbey of Cluny and the sculptures. And so that reform movement, the Cluniac reform movement, led to a larger church reform movement. So we're still in a time where the church and the state are heavily involved in each other's affairs. And the church wants greater separation between the secular and the religious. So as you can recall, kings are anointed by the church, and they are seen as coming from a lineage chosen by God. So the king, the royalty, the whole concept of being a king is tied to religion and religious agreement that this person is chosen by God to rule this vast land. And as I said before, the church benefits because the church has about 1/5 to 1/3 of the land. So they have access to that land. They can manage that land. So it's a mutually beneficial agreement. But now the church actually would like for the state to kind of back off. So we have what's called the investiture contest from 1075 to 1112. And this was a movement led by Pope Gregory VII, and he wanted greater independence from the empire, the Holy Roman Empire, which was led at that point by Henry IV, who was German. So what were the issues at hand? The issues at hand were the appointment of bishops, because at this point it wasn't just the church appointing bishops. Bishops could be appointed by the leader, so it could be appointed by the emperor. Another issue at hand was the farming of the land. The reform movements wanted religious adherents to be able to farm their own land. They were looking for self-sufficiency, though. So at this point, peasants, secular people could farm the land. But what the reform movement wanted, they wanted more self-sufficiency, which meant that the religious order would farm the land and take care of itself. And the third thing is that They wanted governance of their own affairs. Okay. So ultimately, what happened is that the church did manage to kind of diminish the influence of the state. So what they did is they reorganized themselves, and this was something that was really smart. They reorganized themselves, and they further defined what heresy was. They organized church councils. They standardized their rules. And what they did by doing that, by kind of standardizing their system, they gave themselves more credibility because you kind of knew where you stood. So another thing that they did is that they actually managed to have more of a say in government. So they would be able to influence the decision for a specific ruler. Let's say they would want rulers who would agree with their beliefs. They'd rather have somebody in power who is amenable to what they want versus having someone in power who would be confrontational or would not help with their reform movement. So, and that way they're very smart to reorganize, more clearly define the rules, and then give themselves greater credibility and manage on top of that to exercise further influence on the choice of leadership within the state. So that was a big win for the church. Oh, also, I did want to mention before moving on was that so this idea of church versus state, which is going to be one of your discussion questions. So in the United States, theoretically, we have separation of church and state. In France is also a secular country, meaning that there is separation between church and state. However, in France, the separation is taken very seriously. So one of your discussion questions is actually about the separation of church and state in the United States, and if you think that there truly is separation of church and state. So to give you an example, in France, nowadays one of the larger controversies is for students going to school, they're no longer allowed to wear symbols that would indicate their religion. So let's say a Jewish girl could not wear a necklace that has the Star of David. A Muslim girl cannot wear the veil. So anything that kind of denotes your religion is unacceptable within the school. And also in France, there's this idea of France before all. So for the French national identity, being a good citizen comes first. Your religion comes second. Which causes a lot of problems because it is a large cultural difference that's difficult for some to accept. In the United States, it's not, when you ask people what exactly is an American, it's a difficult question to answer. But in France, the idea of fraternity and the unified nation, unified people, one language, one people is very important. So the idea of being a good citizen, being a good French citizen, is number one. Religion is number two. So people who may have different views and see that religion is number one may have a problem in France because the French would not understand why the nation doesn't come first. So this can cause some problems. So just a note to talk about what France is like nowadays and some of the issues that the French are facing, which have been in the news lately. Okay, so here I put on a website. It's basically just more information about the reform movement. If you want to take a look at it and kind of browse through it, it talks about the Pope and what the popes were like and all that kind of stuff. So, okay, now we're going to talk about, we're going to get into the Crusades, which everybody loves the Crusades. So, the Crusades were a religious movement that had the main goal of taking Jerusalem and, retaking the Holy Lands. So, what led up to the Crusades? So, for this, we need to think back a little bit. So, if you recall, the knights were used to defend territories, and they would go into a neighboring territory and just terrorize some of the peasants. And there was a lot of violence and lawlessness on the part of the knights. So the church decided to get involved in all of this, and let's say just they started to think of ways to channel that violence and reduce the terror caused by knights onto peasants. So one of the things that they came up with was, they started this notion of being what we think of when we think of a knight in shining armor, chivalry. So one of the ways to do this is that they established the truce of God, and the truce of God is the idea that the knight won't fight during religious holidays and on Sunday. So the knight will take some time off from fighting. So what this does is it ties knighthood with religion. So now being a knight is not just defense of land or defense of king. It's also involved with religion and your soul and goodness. So this brings a whole different aspect to being a knight. That's not just being a warrior, but actually having some moral value to it. So we're looking at this point. We're looking at Pope Gregory VII, and also, like I mentioned before, Henry IV, whose title is the Holy Roman Emperor, and also in France, King Philip. So the Pope Gregory VII, if you recall from one of the prior slides, Pope Gregory VII was feuding with Henry IV, the investiture contest. So those two were kind of going at it and had problems between each other. So Pope Gregory VII, although he did not like Philip I, he got along a little bit better with Philip I than with Henry IV. So Philip I is Capetian, which from here on out, we basically, for the French royalty, it's no longer the Carolingians or the Merovingians, it's the Capetians. So Pope Gregory VII and Philip I get along a little bit better and decide to think of ways to kind of channel this energy that knights had. So at the time, Jerusalem was under the control of the Turks, and they Gregory VII and Philip I thought it might be a good idea to um, take this aggression that the Knights have and kind of just have it be elsewhere. So this offers kind of a practical solution because it unites the territories instead of one territory fighting another territory and these knights going into this village and pillaging that village, and then the knights from that village coming to the first village and pillaging that village. Now they have a focus, they have a direction. Let's retake the Holy Land. It's, we're Christian, this is what we need to do. We need to retake Jerusalem, take it back from the infidels or Muslims. So their energy is channeled in what is perceived to be a positive direction. And on top of that, it elevates Christianity and it increases the power of the church. So here we go. The First Crusade. Okay, the First Crusade is a massive success. They actually managed to capture Jerusalem. They leave in 1095, about 4,500 knights go on the First Crusade, and Urban II, who's now Pope, is at the Council of Clermont, and he famously says, "Now take up arms against the infidels." So it is a holy war, and it's going to happen. They're going to go do it. So 1095 they leave. By 1099 they have control of Jerusalem, and they have the kingdom of Jerusalem, as well as have taken some other lands as well. So First Crusade, big success. And there you have a picture of bishops along with warriors on their horses, ready to go, ready to fight. So what about the other crusades? Okay, so First Crusade, big success. Retook Jerusalem because it's the city in which Jesus was believed to be buried. So First Crusade, 4,500 knights. By the Third Crusade, they had 150,000 knights, and it's not just knights. A lot of times we might picture just knights going on the crusades and maybe some priests, but knights actually brought their families along, and it was kind of a traveling village, so it wasn't just the knights. Okay, so it's a very long trip. Here you have a map. So you could see they would have left from France. There you see Paris, which is the main point of origin. And you can see just the distance is incredibly far. It's probably the same distance as covering, if you were going to go from LA to New York. And you're doing this on foot. So no trains, nothing like that. It's either your feet or a horse and nothing else. And, at that point they hadn't really they'd gone far, but perhaps not that far. So navigational tools were still pretty rudimentary. Okay, so the Second Crusade was not a success. So they tried to take Damascus in Syria, and it was a complete failure. So that did not happen. The Third Crusade, the First and the Third Crusade are the most successful crusades. So the Third Crusade, they took Cyprus, and they had lost Jerusalem by that point, but they were still allowed access to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was under Muslim control, but they were allowed to enter the city and do, trade or whatever. whatever they wanted to do. Also, the Third Crusade, you had some notable players. You had Philip II, Frederick II Barbarossa, and Richard the Lionheart. So you might have heard of the name Richard the Lionheart, one of the kings of England. And he actually spent much of his life in what is currently France and spoke French. So just a little tidbit. And then the Fourth Crusade, which did not go as planned. Their aim was to go to Egypt, but they ended up in Constantinople, and they sacked the city. So they didn't really take control of the city, but they took everything in the city that they could take. But by 1261, the Byzantines, who were in control of the city before and who kind of lost control somewhat of the city while the Crusaders were there, by 1261 they had regained complete control over Constantinople. So it's kind of a messy time. They're going back and forth. Some of it is a success. They take things, they take cities, and then they lose cities, and they go to the wrong place. But anyways, so First Crusade, big success. They took Jerusalem for a while until it was taken back by the Muslims. Second Crusade, complete failure. Third Crusade was pretty good because they took Cyprus, and they were still allowed access to Jerusalem, so they were able to do trade and do that stuff. Fourth Crusade was not so great. And there were 8 crusades in total, but after the Fourth Crusade, people just started losing interest. So the motivation was not as strong. So the movement kind of petered out. It wasn't some abrupt end. They went on more crusades, but it just wasn't working out. So there were 8 crusades total. It lasted about 2 centuries, so that's a very long time. But in the end, they really were not successful with their original goal, which was to gain a hold of the Holy Land. So, that was that. So here is the map once again. So you can see, Jerusalem on the very bottom there, and the routes are indicated by different colors. Very long routes, and they completely missed Egypt. But there you have it. So those were the Crusades, 2 centuries of traveling back and forth, which these travels will have a major impact on Europe and, truth be told, on our lives, on our everyday lives now. So here I have a little article on a website. It's from the Met Museum. It's a really nice little article that gives you a nice little synopsis of the Crusades, what happened in each one, and also what they did is they have these references within parentheses or in brackets, and they have numbers, and if you click on that, it gives you artworks from the time, just beautiful artworks. So I would encourage you to take a look at that, and it's also a nice, clear explanation of a kind of a messy period of time. So if your book didn't really do much for that, this is a little bit of a clearer way of looking at it. Okay, so now to conclude for this module, Crusades took 200 years, long time. They were meant to take Jerusalem, basically, to claim Jerusalem as a European territory. But what the Crusades ended up doing was that it did unify large swaths of Europe, but also created a us versus them mentality. So now Europeans, or Franks or British or whoever are somewhat more united, but now they're united against foreign lands. So kind of an interesting concept, or way of unifying a nation, um, to build resentment against another religion. Okay, so this is it for this module. In the next module, we're going to be looking at the Capetians. So, like I said, the Capetians, started out pretty small and pretty unremarkably. They basically laid low and had a small territory, but over time, and with some more aggressive rulers, expanded widely, and they end up being the lineage that we often talk about in French history when we're talking about the Revolution and all that stuff. So we'll get to that in the next module. And that's that for now. Thank you.